traveled throughout Central Florida, and he's going to give us a little background, a little history on how Central Florida played a significant role in preparing our guys in World War II. Let's give it a hand for Harv Bucker.
I have to get wired up. Is that working?
Yes, working.
Okay. I appreciate being here, and thank you for being here. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation. Before we get started, I just want to say I've been part of Fairway for a good number of years, and I have never seen the men's group as dynamic and well done as it is now. So congratulations to Jerry and all his people. I think we owe them a debt of gratitude for all the work they've done. I want to give you a little background. I have lived in Florida most of my life. I attended schools in Ocala, 4th grade through graduation from high school. I picked up a undergraduate degree at Florida State and joined state government. In the mid-70s, the state had a push to open a number of new prisons downstate, and I wanted to be part of that. So in 1977, I moved my family to Lakeland. Lakeland was our home until retiring to the Villages. After moving to Lakeland, I became an administrative hearing officer for the Parole Commission. That job required me to move quite a bit, travel quite a bit, and I traveled extensively through the southwestern part of the state, those counties down there. And I noticed the commonality among all the small towns that I traveled to, and that was that many of them had airports that had been training facilities during World War II. I was quite taken by that and sought to learn more about what they did. Let me stop here and say that there are a lot of guys, or several guys in our group here this morning that know a whole lot more about this than I do. I'm not an aviation historian necessarily, but I am interested in this little corner of the business of training airmen, especially during the World War II era. From what I've learned, the training typically consisted of 3 months of basic training for airmen here in Florida, 3 months of basic aircraft training, and 3 months of actual flight training. Most of the basic training for pilots was in Stearman biplanes. The Stearmans were built by the Boeing company, and they produced about 10,000 of them during the wartime years. Stearman seated a student and an instructor in inline open cockpits. There was usually no cowling around the engine. The engines were radial engines, 7 cylinders, and they produced 225 horsepower. So with that radial engine without a cowling on it sticking out between those 2 wings in front gave it a very distinctive appearance. In my younger days, I was seeing quite a number of these, but we don't see them quite as much anymore, but there were a lot of them built and a lot of them still around. In Florida, after the war, a lot of them became spray for spraying citrus and other farm crops, and were used that way. The skin of Stearman was canvas over a metal tube frame. If you've ever flown in a canvas-covered airplane, it's quite a memorable experience and one you probably never would forget. I was ready to kiss the ground when I got out of it. Advanced flight operations spanned the whole range of military flying, from fighters to bombers, air-to-sea combat, and other specialty training. Some of the bases in Florida had dual functions, flight training and submarine detection. The sighting of German U-boats in Florida waters was quite common, and they had to be on constant patrol concerning those. There was a rush to build training airfields in Florida during the early 1940s in the build-up to the war and after World War II was declared. Recalling that World War II for the United States was only a 4-year war, it's remarkable that so much was accomplished in such a short time. Not only was the war fought and won during that brief period, but the entire industrial enterprise of the nation was converted for wartime purposes. Many of you come from the industrial north, and you probably know the conversion to wartime industry from peacetime pretty well. In Florida, there was no industry. So our contribution was pretty much the same thing that brought most of you here, warm weather. But it was vital, and the military planners knew that they could count on flying most days of the year because of our climate. And the equipment required less maintenance because of the climate. Airmen required no cold weather gear, and altogether the climate was just right for training airmen, very similar to what they would experience in the Pacific and elsewhere. So it was an ideal situation for training airmen, and that's what Central Florida more or less became known for during the war. Another factor in the placement of these training bases was the sparse population. Fewer buildings meant fewer things to crash into, frankly. They knew that the casualty count would be high, and it was. In the Tampa Bay region, a common term was one a day in the Bay. They lost a lot of planes. The casualty rate was high. Also, much of this buildup was soon after Pearl Harbor. And the military was worried about the possibility of clustering facilities close together like they had at Pearl. And they determined that they didn't want any more battleship rows with things, good targets, very close together. So that was one of the main things that caused them to build small airfields in or near small towns, which there were plenty of them in Florida at that time, and they did so. Many of those are in the center of the state and in places that you know well. The territory that I covered in my work for the state included many of those small towns. Though there was a whole lot of activity in South Florida, what I'm familiar with mostly is the activity north of Lake Okeechobee, running along the Central Ridge up to pretty much where we live now. Have you heard the ridge referred to? I'm sure a lot of you probably know what the ridge is. It's a geological feature that runs for about 100 miles through the center of the state, north and south. It's officially called the Lake Wales Ridge. And a little further south of here, you'll hear people talk about over on the ridge. They're referring to people who live in towns along US 27. US 27 pretty much follows the ridge all the way downstate. The towns that are known to have supported training bases in Central Florida are those shown on the maps that you have there at the table. There are others in the state, but these are the ones that I've spent most time in and know most about. Most of those bases that we'll be talking about were operated by the Army Air Corps.
Go Army!
Yes. But other branches also established some bases in parts of the state. In the 80 years since the end of World War II, there have obviously been a lot of changes in those towns and surrounding areas where those bases were, but some of them can be pretty well identified up until today. After the war, most of those bases were turned over to the towns and counties that they were in. Many became industrial parks, municipal facilities, ballparks, prison sites, and general aviation airports. Some house museums where the wartime history is documented and pretty well preserved. Quickly, let me discuss some of the air bases in more detail. Beginning at the top of, at the bottom of the map, the air base at Arcadia is best remembered as a joint fighter training base for US and British airmen. There's a cemetery and an annual remembrance there for the few dozen British airmen that were killed in training accidents. The Okeechobee Air Base was used for bomber training. It had the distinction of providing touch-and-go training for heavy bombers, mostly from Sebring. Can you imagine a flying fortress doing touch-and-goes? That would have really been something I'd love to have seen. The Okeechobee Air Base reverted to a municipal air base for the city of, or town of Okeechobee after the war. The base at Sebring was called Hendricks Airfield. It housed squadrons of B-17s, there you go, and B-24s. The B-17 was called Flying Fortress, and the B-24 was called the Liberator. They were both heavy bombers and had high capacity for munitions. The 17s and the 24s were pretty much the bombers that we would find in all of the bomber bases in Central Florida. The B-17 was a true workhorse for the European theater. 12,700 of them were built. Can you imagine 12,700 airplanes in that relatively short period? The production was just astounding. They were well loved by both US and British flyers. They were defended by 30 caliber machine guns, carried a maximum capacity of 8,000 pounds of bombs, and the B-17 is believed to have dropped 40% of all the bombs dropped in Europe by by Allied forces. It was also a very durable plane. Many of them returned to base, even though they had extensive damage. The B-24, again called the Liberator, joined the B-17 as the most utilized heavy bomber during the war. 18,500 of them were built, and interestingly, 8,700 of those were built by the Ford Motor Company. I know we got some Ford guys here, so you can be proud of that contribution. That goes to the factory conversion that we were talking about earlier. They went from civilian production of automobiles to massive production of airplanes. Though it was sold as being faster and flying higher than the B-17, the B-24 missed the mark. It maxed out a few thousand feet of altitude less than the B-17, but it was just a little bit faster. Another feature of the B-24 was the fact that it was built on a tricycle undercarriage, which meant that instead of being a tail dragger, it sat pretty much level with the tarmac, and gave it a kind of an interesting appearance. Also, it had somewhat squared off sides to the fuselage. Both those things together gave it the nickname the Flying Boxcar. You probably have heard that. So back to the air bases. Today, the Sebring Air Base remains an airport, but it also houses a major flight school. It also houses a sports car racetrack. You've probably heard of the 12 Hours at Sebring. It's a very famous endurance race. It's been done for a lot of years now. The racetrack is carved out of the original concrete runways that were designed for the heavy bombers. Those runways are configured in several different directions, which allow for some interesting curves and hairpin turns for the track. They say that the runways are really rough and make the racetrack a true endurance experience. Avon Park remains an Air Force base today. Its primary mission is management of the Avon Park bombing range. They do live bombing down there in a very large area that runs all the way out to the Kissimmee River. A lot of land. And as I say, it's still in operation today. Base property at Avon Park also houses 2 major prisons and a juvenile correctional center. When I first began going there for interviews and hearings, I was given use of a conference room in one of the original World War II barracks. When planes flew over, the rickety old windows rattled like tambourines. When planes flew over, those rickety old barracks are now torn down. The fire marshal proved to the state that they could burn in about 5 minutes, and so they decided probably best not to put people there. I'm sure some of you have lived in World War II barracks during your time in the service. They were mostly made out of wood boards covered with tar paper. They burned real good. If you visit Avon Park, you might want to have a meal at the Hotel Jacaranda in downtown Avon Park. If you go there, it's like walking back into the 1940s. It's actually on the Register of Historical Places, and it's quite an interesting experience. During the war, the hotel was the center of social life, and there's also a nearby museum where most of the Avon Park military history is preserved. The Bartow Air Base was a fighter training base. It's probably the best preserved of all the World War II bases. It's a little way out of town and saw sparse use as an industrial park during the latter half of the 20th century. In recent years, it's changed quite a bit. However, the general layout of the base is pretty much unchanged. There's a very good museum there at the Bartow Air Base. Lakeland had 2 fighter bases. If you've been to baseball training, and I know some of you just did that, you're familiar with the stadium out on the shore of Lake Parker. That was called Lodwick Field. When we moved there, some of the air base buildings were still in operation, hangars and maintenance buildings. And the stadium is constructed on what would have been the tarmac for the air base. The second air base, Drain Field, is now the municipal airport at Lakeland. It's built out west of town. By the way, you guys from Michigan are sure to know that Lakeland has hosted the Detroit Tigers spring training for 60 years. That's longer than any other town and ball club pairing by a long, long way. The Lakeland Tigers is a minor league team, and the local folks are pretty proud of that as well. An air base at Tampa was commissioned just before the start of World War II as MacDill Army Air Base. Its mission was bomber training. It was transferred to the Air Force in 1947 when that branch of the service was born. MacDill today houses Central Command, or CENTCOM, which has jurisdiction over all United States military operations in the Middle East. Quite a big challenge. And military personnel from many nations are housed there as a result of the CENTCOM involvement. The second base at Tampa was called Drew Field. Drew Field had the distinction of being the primary aircraft warning training facility for ground observation and radar. You might not be familiar with that, but that's a very important function, was a very important function during World War II. Civilian and military personnel were brought there from all over the country for aircraft warning training. We need to recall that it was feared during World War II that the mainland could be attacked at any time. There was a great fear that we would come under attack. So these aircraft warning training personnel were responsible for maintaining observation and surveillance of the entire coastline, both east and west, as well as the north and south borders of the country. Quite a big job. They needed to be proficient in distinguishing types of aircraft and determining if they presented a danger in any respect. Drew Field is now Tampa International Airport. So if you've been to Tampa International, that's how it started. The air base at Orlando was McCoy Air Force Base, and it is now the Orlando International Airport. Most of us have been there. McCoy housed fighter bomber for training, as well as had smaller bases around Central Florida for support. McCoy later housed a squadron of B-52 bombers, the really big ones. Kissimmee Air Base was the sub-base of Orlando and housed a major fighter squadron. Zephyr Hills Air Base trained fighter pilots. It's now the Zephyr Hills the Zephyr Hills Municipal Airport. And you'd never guess it, but it housed a squadron of P-51 Mustangs. Pretty cool. The Mustang was thought to be the most reliable fighter and fighter bomber of the war. It could fly faster and higher than any of the competition. It was originally built for the British before the war, but eventually saw combat in every theater of the war. 15,500 of them were built, and they served well into the Korean War, even with the advent of jet airplanes. The P-51s were armed with 30 and 50 caliber machine guns and could carry 1,000 pounds of bombs or rockets under its belly. Very, very dependable aircraft. The Brooksville Air Base was a bomber base. The former base is now the Brooksville Tampa Bay Regional Airport. It's a busy hub for civilian and military air traffic. There's a Florida National Guard detachment of Black Hawk helicopter station there, as well as fixed-wing aircraft. From time to time, the Black Hawks can be seen flying in formation around here. They're quite imposing, and they make a whole lot of noise. We had some flying over our place just maybe 2 weeks ago, and you can't help but pay attention. The Brooksville Air Base now houses county buildings, the sheriff's office, jail, as well as a state prison is there. The former training base closest to us is Leesburg. Leesburg was a sub-base of Orlando, and its mission was joint tactical training with McCoy. If you're familiar with Ocala, you might be interested to know that the whole section of land from where the Paddock Mall is, following Road 200 all the way into town where it meets Pine Avenue, all of that land was the air base. It was called the Jim Taylor Air Base. And when I was there as a student, all of that land was fenced off. And it was the Ocala Regional Airport at that time. Of course, it's been moved now. If you're familiar with Road 200, you know that there's a constant, there's no open land out there anymore. It's constantly full of commercial buildings. When I was there in the 60s, there was no commercial building whatsoever. Everything from in town out to where I-75 is was completely open. A few houses is all you would see out there. Hard to believe, but it's the way it was. There's still a bombing range at the Ocala National Forest. It's called the Pine Castle Range. It's operated by the Navy. It's about 35, 40 miles from where we are here. It's been in continuous use since early in World War II. I've been told by some villagers that they can still hear ordnance exploding out there, although I can't verify that. I've never personally heard any. The Navy does publish advance notification of when they're going to be doing bombing exercises. So if you're interested in learning more or seeing some of these things, you might be interested